As a child, hearing the words "the Elephant Man" conjured up images of a hideous monster that haunted my dreams. It wasn't until I was in my teens that I learned the tragic tale of the Elephant Man, and about who or what he actually was. Joseph Merrick was born in Leicester, England on the 5th of August 1862. He was a normal baby, but before the age of 5 he began to show the first signs of the horror that was to befall him. His head and body began to swell, causing him to be badly disfigured. He attended school and had a relatively normal childhood despite his growing deformities. His parents blamed his deformities on his mother Mary being frightened and getting knocked over by a fairground elephant when she was pregnant with Joseph. When Joseph was only 10 years old, his mother died of bronchitis. His mother's death shattered Joseph's life. He and his mother had been close, and his mother was Joseph's protector. Now she was gone, life was about to get a lot harder on poor Joseph. It was around this time that Joseph fell and damaged his hip, causing him to be permanently disabled and struggling to walk. He left school at the age of 13, which was not unusual for the time. His father and new stepmother showed him no affection, and in fact Joseph's life was now a pure misery. He found work in a cigar factory, but this didn't last long as his increasingly badly deformed hand made the job impossible. His father regularly beat him, causing him to run away from home several times. When returning home after once running away, his father gave him a severe beating. Joseph ran away from home for good. He was homeless and living on the streets of Leicester. He was at rock bottom. Hearing of his plight, his uncle Charles Merrick, a Leicester barber, tracked him down and offered to put him up at his house. Joseph continued to be unemployed and unable to pay his way for the next couple of years until eventually Charles said he could no longer afford to look after him. At the age of 17, Joseph entered the Leicester Union Workhouse. It seemed as though he had no choice. A workhouse was a tough place to live. Food and accommodation was given in exchange for doing tedious, menial jobs such as picking apart old bits of rope into its constituent strands. A workhouse was much akin to a working prison, with the inmates living in squalor. People went there as a last resort, when they had nowhere to live and no income. Not only the lowest rungs of society populated a workhouse, but also members of the upper classes that had fallen on hard times. A workhouse was organized into classes the same way society was, with the higher classes living in much better accommodation than the general population. In 1882, Joseph had surgery on his face, as by now his deformities were becoming more severe. He was operated on by Dr. Clement Frederick Bryan in the workhouse. He had a large amount of excess tissue removed from around his mouth, helping him to talk more clearly. After around 4 years in the workhouse, he signed himself out and got into the business of freak shows. This is where he was given the name the Elephant Man and was advertised as being half man, half elephant. He was shown around the East Midlands and ended up being moved to London, where he was given a new manager, a Mr. Tom Norman. Norman was horrified when he first saw Joseph and almost considered Joseph too hideous to show the public. Thinking of the money he could make out of Joseph persuaded him to put him on display anyway. He was put in the back of an empty shop on Whitechapel Road where people paid to come and see the Elephant Man. The shop was covered in posters of the half man, half elephant. Customers would be visibly shocked when the curtain was pulled back revealing Joseph. This Elephant Man exhibit would be reasonably successful, giving Joseph an income, most of which he saved, hoping to buy a home of his own one day. A surgeon named Frederick Treves took an interest in Joseph. Later in 1923 he wrote about Joseph.
The most disgusting specimen of humanity that I had ever seen. At no time had I met with such a degraded or perverted version of a human being as this lone figure displayed.
Treves persuaded Joseph to come to his surgery for an examination. To get to the surgery and so as to not draw any unwanted attention, Joseph wore a costume consisting of an oversized black cloak and a brown cap with a hessian sack covering his face, and rode in a cab hired by Treves. At the surgery, due to Joseph being so quiet and shy, Treves assumed that he was an imbecile with an extremely low IQ. He measured Joseph's head circumference at the large size of 36 inches, his right wrist at 12 inches, and one of his fingers at 5 inches in circumference. He noted that his skin was covered in warty growths, the largest of which exuded an unpleasant smell. The subcutaneous tissue appeared to be weakened and caused a loosening of the skin, which in some areas hung away from the body. There were bone deformities in the right arm, both legs, and most conspicuously, in the large skull. Despite the corrective surgery to his mouth in 1882, Joseph's speech remained barely intelligible. Apart from his deformities and the lameness in his hip, Treves concluded that Joseph appeared to be in good general health. His left arm and hand were practically untouched by the disease, and of a normal size. His manager Tom Norman later recalled that Joseph went to the hospital for examination 2 or 3 times, and during one of their meetings, Treves gave Joseph his calling card. On one of the visits, Treves had photographs taken, and he provided Joseph with a set of copies which were later added to his autobiographical pamphlet. On December 2, Treves presented Joseph at a meeting of the Pathological Society of London in Bloomsbury. Eventually, Joseph told Norman that he no longer wanted to be examined at the hospital. According to Norman, he said he was stripped naked and felt like an animal in a cattle market. At this time in Victorian Britain, tastes were changing in regard to freak show exhibitions like the Elephant Man. Shows like Norman's were a cause for public concern, both on the grounds of decency and due to the disruption caused by crowds gathering outside them. Not long after Joseph's last examination with Frederick Treves, the police closed down Norman's shop on Whitechapel Road, and Joseph's Leicester managers withdrew him from Norman's care. In 1885, Joseph Merrick went on the road with Sam Roper's traveling fair. He befriended 2 other performers, Roper's midgets, Bertram Dooley and Harry Bramley, who on occasion defended Joseph from public harassment. The dampening of public enthusiasm for freak shows and human oddities continued, and the police and magistrates became increasingly vigilant in closing down shows. Joseph remained a horrifying spectacle for his viewers, and Roper grew nervous about the negative attention the Elephant Man drew from local authorities. Joseph's group of managers decided he should go on tour in continental Europe, with the hope that authorities there would be more lenient. Joseph's management was assumed by an unknown man, and they left for the continent. The Elephant Man was no more successful in Europe than in Britain, and similar action was taken by authorities to move him out of their jurisdictions. In Brussels, Joseph was deserted by this new manager, who stole his £50 savings. Abandoned, Joseph made his way by train to Ostend, where he attempted to board a ferry for Dover but was refused passage. He travelled to Antwerp, and was able to board a ship bound for Harwich in Essex. From there he travelled by train to London, and arrived at Liverpool Street Station. Joseph arrived at Liverpool Street Station on June 24, 1886, safely back in his own country, but with nowhere to go. was not eligible to enter a workhouse in London for more than one night, and would be accepted only by Leicester Union, where he became a permanent resident. Leicester was 98 miles away. He approached strangers for help, but his speech was unintelligible and his appearance repugnant. He drew a crowd of curious onlookers until a policeman helped him into an empty waiting room, where he huddled in a corner, exhausted. Unable to make himself understood, his only identifying possession was Frederick Treves' card. The police contacted Treves, who went to the station. Recognizing Joseph, Treves took him in a hansom cab to the London hospital. Joseph was admitted for bronchitis, washed, fed, and then put to bed in a small isolation room in the hospital's attic. With Joseph admitted into the hospital, Treves now had time to conduct a more thorough examination. He discovered that Joseph's physical condition had deteriorated over the previous 2 years, and that he had become quite impaired by his deformities. Treves also suspected that Joseph now had a heart condition, and had only a few years left to live. Joseph's general health improved over the next 5 months under the care of the hospital staff. Although some nurses were initially upset by his appearance, they overcame this and cared for him. The problem of his unpleasant odor was mitigated through frequent bathing, and Treves gradually developed an understanding of Joseph's speech. A new set of photographs was taken. The question of Joseph's long-term care had to be addressed. Francis Cargom, the chairman of the hospital committee, had supported Treves in his decision to admit Joseph, but by November, long-term plans needed to be made. The London hospital was not equipped or staffed to provide care for the incurable, which Joseph clearly was. Cargom contacted other institutions and hospitals more suited to caring for chronic cases, but none would accept Joseph. Gom wrote a letter to the Times, printed on December 4, outlining Joseph's case and asking readers for suggestions. The public response in letters and donations was significant, and the situation was even covered by the British Medical Journal. With the financial backing of the many donors, Gom was able to make a convincing case to the committee for keeping Joseph in the hospital. It was decided that he would be allowed to stay there for the remainder of his life. He was moved from the attic to 2 rooms in the basement adjacent to a small courtyard. The rooms were adapted and furnished to suit Joseph, with a specially constructed bed and, at Treves's instruction, no mirrors. Joseph settled into his new life at the London hospital. Treves visited him daily and spent a couple of hours with him every Sunday. Now that Joseph had found someone who understood his speech, he was delighted to carry on long conversations with the doctor. Treves and Joseph built a friendly relationship, although Joseph never completely confided in him. He told Treves that he was an only child, and Treves had the impression that his mother, whose picture Joseph always carried with him, had abandoned him as a baby. Joseph was also reluctant to talk about his exhibition days, although he expressed gratitude towards his former managers. It did not take Treves long to realize that, contrary to his initial impressions, Joseph was not intellectually impaired. Treves observed that Joseph was very sensitive and showed his emotions easily. At times, Joseph was bored and lonely and demonstrated signs of depression. He had spent his entire adult life segregated from women, first in the workhouse and then as an exhibit. The women he met were either disgusted or frightened by his appearance. His opinions about women were derived from his memories of his mother and what he read in books. Treves decided that Joseph would like to be introduced to a woman, and it would help him feel normal. The doctor arranged for a friend of his named Mrs. Layla Maturin, a young and pretty widow, to visit Joseph. She agreed, and with fair warning about his appearance, she went to his rooms for an introduction. The meeting was short, as Joseph quickly became overcome with emotion. He later told Treves that Maturin had been the first woman ever to smile at him, and the first to shake his hand. She kept in contact with him, and a letter written by Joseph to her, thanking her for the gift of a book and a brace of grouse, is the only surviving letter written by Joseph. This first experience of meeting a woman, though brief, instilled in Joseph a new sense of self-confidence. He met other women during his life at the hospital, and appeared taken with them all. Treves believed that Joseph's hope was to go to live at an institution for the blind, where he might meet a woman who could not see his deformities. Joseph's condition gradually deteriorated during his 4 years at the London hospital. He required a great deal of care from the nursing staff and spent much of his time in bed, or sitting in his quarters, with diminishing energy. His facial deformities continued to grow, and his head became even more enlarged. He died on April 11, 1890, at the age of 27. At around 3 p.m. Treves's house surgeon visited Joseph, and found him lying dead across his bed. His body was formally identified by his uncle, Charles Merrick. An inquest was held on April 27 by one Edwin Baxter, who had come to notoriety conducting inquests for the Jack the Ripper murders of 1888. His death was ruled accidental, and the certified cause of death was asphyxia, caused by the weight of his head as he lay down. Treves, who performed an autopsy, said Joseph had died of a dislocated neck, which likely severed his vertebral arteries. Knowing that Joseph had always slept sitting upright out of necessity, Treves concluded that Joseph must have made the experiment, attempting to sleep lying down, like other people. Joseph did not receive a burial, with almost all sections of his body, both skeleton and soft tissue, being preserved for study. Treves dissected his body and took plaster casts of his head and limbs. He took skin samples, which were later lost during the Second World War, and mounted his skeleton, which remains in the pathology collection at the Royal London Hospital. His mounted skeleton at the medical school is not on public display. It is thought that Joseph had a combination of both Proteus syndrome and neurofibromatosis, two extremely rare genetic diseases. Ever since the dawn of genetic research, tests have been carried out on Joseph Merrick's DNA, but have always come back as inconclusive. So we can most certainly say that the Elephant Man was not the monster that I imagined as a child. He was in fact an intelligent young gentleman that showed a lot of empathy towards other human beings. And this was despite the cruel way he had been treated during his relatively short life. Thank you for watching. Have a great day whoever and wherever you are. Please subscribe and give a like if you enjoyed this video.